Hi all, so today we're going to be looking at the poem by Richard Lovelace, To Althea from Prison. Now as you can see, he lived from 1617 to 1657. Now, Richard Lovelace was quite a character. He was a dashing, handsome, well-educated person, and he's someone whose lifestyle was contrary to that of the Puritans of the time. Now, the Puritans were people who believed that the culture had become too excessive and religion had become too excessive and that it needed to get back to a very pure and basic state. So in other words, they believed that you shouldn't have any excess, you shouldn't have any happiness, all of that. So he lived his life completely contrary to that, and he celebrated happiness and he celebrated excess. Now Richard Lovelace was known as a cavalier poet, like many others of his time. They were royalists, in other words, people who supported King Charles I, who was the King of England at the time there. Now, these cavalier poets were typically aristocrats, born into wealthy, influential families. They had money, they had land, they had education, and they tended to write poetry about the sensual pleasures in life, about romantic love, and tended to shy away from deeper subjects. And as such, they tended to not really notice or write about the problems and issues within England at the time. In other words, the poetry very often used to tend towards propaganda in the support for Charles I. Now, King Charles I was a king of a very troubled England, a very troubled Britain, and he ended up dissolving Parliament three times. He faced rebellion. He was eventually executed in 1649 after a civil war between the supporters of the king and the supporters of Parliament. Now, it was in his unfailing loyalty to King Charles I that Lovelace was imprisoned twice in his life. And the first time he was imprisoned for 7 weeks in a prison called Gatehouse Prison. You can see a little picture, an artist rendering of Gatehouse Prison in the 18th century there. And this was a prison that was originally connected to Westminster Abbey, where the priest or the bishop that is in charge of Westminster Abbey would imprison people that he felt needed imprisonment in this gatehouse prison. So what happened was that Lovelace delivered a petition, a pro-royalist petition to Parliament, in protest of the bishop's exclusion bill. Now what happened was that this bill robbed the bishops in the land of much of their political authority. In other words, they weren't allowed to just arrest people, they weren't allowed to exert their power over people, and so on. And because of this, he was imprisoned for 7 weeks in this gatehouse prison. And it was during this period of imprisonment that he wrote To Althea from Prison. Now, his second imprisonment was a little bit later. He left England at one stage and he went to fight for the King of France. And when he returned to England in 1646, he was imprisoned in the Peterhouse prison for 6 months just because he was a supporter of Charles I. Right, so let's read through the poem and then we can look at the structure and do an analysis of it. To Althea from Prison. When love with unconfined wings hovers within my gates, and my divine Althea brings to whisper at the grates, when I lie tangled in her hair and fettered to her eye, the gods in wanton in the air know no such liberty. When flowing cups run swiftly round with no allaying Thames, our careless heads with roses bound, our hearts with royal flames. When thirsty grief in wine we steep, and healths and draughts go free, fishes that tipple in the deep know no such liberty. When like committed linnets I with shriller throat shall sing the sweetness, mercy, majesty, and glories of my King. When I shall voice aloud how good he is, how great shall be, enlarged winds that curl the flood know no such liberty. Stone walls do not a prison make, nor iron bars a cage. Mine's innocent and quiet take that for a hermitage. If I have freedom in my love, and in my soul am free, angels alone that soar above enjoy such liberty. So let's have a quick look at the structure of the poem. Now, the first thing that's noticeable is the fact that the poem alters between iambic tetrameter and iambic trimeter. Now, just a reminder about these two terms. Iambic tetrameter consists of 8 syllables, or 4 feet, each consisting of 2 syllables. So if we look at the first line over there, you'll see I've divided it into its 4 feet, and I have put in caps the stressed syllables. Now, iambic meter always starts in an unstressed syllable. Notice also in the last foot of the first line, in the fourth foot over there, you'll see that confined, that stress on the E over there, is purposefully put in there in order to create an extra syllable in that word, because normally we would pronounce that confined. Okay, so you'll notice the second line is written in iambic trimeter, and this is a line that consists of 6 syllables or 3 feet, each consisting of 2 syllables. Alright, so we have that alternation between iambic tetrameter and iambic trimeter. And what this does is it adds to the reading of the poem, and it kind of forces the reader to read the poem in groups of 2 lines. Okay, so in other words, line 1 and line 2, line 3 and line 4, and so on and so forth throughout the poem. Another nice and interesting thing about iambic meter is that in itself it adds rhythm to the way that you would read the poem. Then just another couple of small things in terms of the structure of the poem. The poem is written in 3 stanzas of 8 lines, and the rhyme scheme you'll see I've color coded it over there is A B A B C D C D in each stanza. So let's start looking at the poem stanza by stanza. Now, the overarching theme of the poem, or idea behind the poem, is that no matter what physical circumstances you might find yourself in. Now, in this poem, we know that the speaker, or Lovelace as speaker, is imprisoned. Okay, and even though he is imprisoned, there's a concept that no one can imprison the human mind. So there's a paradox that the whole poem rests on. Remember, paradox is something that at first seems illogical, but after thinking about it a little bit, you can see the sense in it. Now, the entire poem rests on the paradox that the imprisoned person, or man in this case, is in fact free. In other words, we know that it's the mind that's actually free over here. There's something else that one notices through the length of the poem, and we start to see it in the first stanza over here, and that's the use of anaphora. Now, anaphora, if we recall, is the constant repetition of a word to create emphasis. And we see it over here with the use of the word when. We see there, when love with unconfined wings, and in line 5, when I lie tangled in her hair. Now we see this used throughout the poem, and it's called anaphora. Now, the first stanza, the main idea in there is that the speaker, who is in prison, is given freedom through love. So in other words, it's love that grants him freedom. And as we look at the first line, we'll see that it talks about love with unconfined wings. Now we notice here, first of all, that there's the repetition of the W over there, which gives us some alliteration. But we notice that love is something free and unconfined over here. In other words, love is something that knows no limits, if you look at that word, unconfined. Another thing to notice is the use of the capital letter L with love over there, and we kind of get this metaphor here comparing love to this winged, possibly angelic figure, because if we look at the fourth stanza of the poem, we'll notice there's a reference to angels over there. And this angelic, or this winged concept of love, it says it hovers within my gates. Okay, so it is there within the gates of the prison, possibly within the gates of his heart as well. Okay, something that's within him. And what does it do? This love brings Althea to him, and my divine Althea brings. Now, Althea, this person over here, is probably a reference to Lovelace's love, Lucy Sackville, who is often referred to as Lucasta in other poems of his. And what happens is that Althea comes to whisper at the grates. Now, these grates that love comes to whisper at would be the bars of the prison that he's within at the moment. And it's interesting if we just examine that word whisper for a moment there. Now, a whisper is something that is very often seen as a secretive action, and it's also a very gentle thing. Yeah. Now, if someone's in prison, they don't see much gentleness, so that's quite significant if Althea's coming with a sense of gentleness to him. But also, there's that sense of secretiveness over here, where the love that he has with Althea is something that's secret between the two of them. Okay, so this is whispered at the grates, whispered at the bars of the prison so that no one else can overhear. And he says there, when I lie tangled in her hair and fettered to her eye. You'll notice there that there's some internal rhyme here with I and la, and there's a repetition of the H with her and hair over there. Okay, so that's some alliteration over there. So we'll notice there that he's tangled in her hair and he's fettered to her eye. Now, these two words, tangled and fettered, they generally seem to suggest something that's confined or imprisoned. Okay, think of if you're tangled up in something, you're unable to get out of it. And to be fettered means to be bound to something. Okay, so this almost gives us a sense of confinement, but for the speaker of the poem, it's the very act of being fettered to her eye, in other words, attached to her gaze, eye to eye, and to be tangled in the hair of this divine Althea that has been brought to him, that provides him with some sense of freedom over here. And what happens, it says, the gods that wanton in the air know no such liberty. Notice there's the repetition of the N sound with no and no over there, and there's also internal rhyme in those two words over there. So what he's saying here is that even the gods that are free and in the air and floating around in the air that seem to be completely free, they don't know as much liberty as this love that he feels provides for him. Right, so as we get into the second stanza, we'll see that the theme or the main idea of the stanza changes, where the first stanza talked about freedom through love, the second stanza talks about freedom through revelry, in particular drinking with friends and so on, and also there's a sense of a loyalty towards the crown and the king over here. So as we look at the first line, it mentions when flowing cups run swiftly round. Now, the cups running here is an example of personification, and what is referred to here is that excessive drinking. Okay, a lavish lifestyle over here. So the cups are running swiftly round. In other words, there are many drinks going around to the people. And it says this happens with no allaying Thames. Now, allaying means to temper something. And what it means here is it could be understood in two different ways. One is that the drinks aren't diluted, in other words, at full potency. And on the other hand, the Thames being this river that runs through England, just the same way that politics runs through a country, it could mean that the conversation or the enjoyment isn't tempered or it isn't diluted by a worry about politics or worry for politics. And we'll see a little bit later that this would be because these people, and the speaker in particular, are so secure in their loyalty for the king that the politics wouldn't affect them. Right, so this Thames representing the whole idea of politics would be an example of metonymy. Okay, and we know, like I've typed over there, that metonymy would be an aspect of an idea representing the whole idea itself. So in this case, the Thames, or the aspect of just this river running through, represents the whole idea of politics in and of itself. Now the next two lines read, our careless heads with roses bound, our hearts with loyal flames. Now, first of all, the careless heads, you'd notice that word careless means not to worry about anything or not worried about anything. And at that stage, they're so engrossed in their drinking and revelry that they don't have a care in the world, basically. And what it says there, our heads with roses bound. Now, roses have for a long time been a symbol of the English monarchy, and what this means is that their heads are bound. In other words, they are thinking about the monarchy, thinking about the king, and their loyalty to the king the whole time. Now, that is once again an example of metonymy, where a single idea represents a whole idea. Okay, so here we've got the roses representing the entire English monarchy. And
it goes on the next line to say our hearts with loyal flames. Now, if we think about it, to keep a flame burning, it's kind of that sense of fieriness, of loyalty. All right, and this is, of course, our loyalty that we see with the speaker towards the king. Right, as we look at the rest of the second stanza, the next line says, when thirsty grief in wine we steep. Notice first of all the repetition of the W there, so that's alliteration, and it talks about steeping their grief in wine. Now, to steep something means to soak something in. So, what they're basically saying here is that the speaker, when they're upset about something, if they drink enough wine, they won't be upset about it any longer. Then it goes on to say, when healths and draughts go free. So not only are the drinks and the toasts free, I think about the fact that these poets, these cavalier poets, were very wealthy noblemen, so they really didn't have a care about money and so on. But also the drinks themselves represent freedom. Okay, so that healths and draughts. Healths would be the toasts, draughts would be the drinks that they're drinking. They represent freedom. And then he ends off with that same type of idea as we see in the end of each stanza. Fishes that tipple in the deep know no such liberty. Alright, so the fishes that tipple, to tipple means to drink excessively. So think about it, a fish is swimming in the water and it is constantly drinking water because that's the way it breathes. So it's saying that even those fish that can go wherever they want in the ocean or the river or wherever they're swimming, they don't know the type of liberty that these people know when they drink and carouse while being loyal to the king. Right, so as we move into the third stanza, we'll notice that the main idea of that stanza is that the speaker finds freedom through singing the praises of the king. Now remember, the first stanza he found freedom through love. The second stanza he found freedom through drinking and carousing with loyalty to the king. And now in the third stanza he finds freedom through his singing of the praises of the king. Now, as we get into the first line, we'll see there it says, when like committed linnets I with shriller throat shall sing. And a linnet, you can see I've put a little picture over there, is a type of songbird. And what he's saying here is that he shall sing louder and better than this linnet. And what this will do is obviously get people's attention, and he'll be able to get them to listen to what he has to sing. And what he has to sing is told to us in the next two lines. And he says, it's the sweetness, mercy, majesty, and glories of my king. So you'll see that these are qualities that the speaker sees the king as having. It's almost like a justification for his extreme loyalty to Charles I over here. And let's go through those qualities first. The sweetness. So you'll see in that sweetness means there's kindness, there's gentleness, all of those type of things. Mercy. I remember in those days a king could mete out justice, order executions. Alright, so the mercy would mean that the king knows when to be merciful, when to let somebody off. The majesty, in other words, the greatness in his being a king, and the glories, in other words, the great things that he's done that's brought glory upon him. And these are all qualities that the speaker sees the king as having. So one can really notice here that there's almost a sense of propaganda in what's being said over here, in that the speaker seems to be trying to convince the listener or the reader of how great King Charles I is over here. But the stanza ends off saying that when I shall voice aloud how good he is, how great should be. So in other words, that singing the praises of the king that he mentioned earlier, when he does that, talks about how good the king is, how great he should be, about all those qualities of the king. It says, enlarged winds that curl the flood no such liberty. Now enlarged, you'll notice that accent on the E over there in order to create an extra syllable so that it fits into the Iambic Tetrameter. It says that enlarged winds that curl the flood, these great gales, in other words, very strong winds that curl the flood, that create these waves and chops and so on the ocean over there. Those winds that can go wherever they want, they can blow wherever they want without anything stopping them. Even those winds don't know the type of liberty that he feels when he sings the glory of his king. Right, moving into the final stanza of the poem, we'll see that the idea in this final stanza is that true freedom comes from the mind. And it starts off by saying, stone walls do not a prison make, nor iron bars a cage. I think of a prison, especially in the old days, would have had thick stone walls, and they would have had iron bars where the window should be, creating a kind of cage. And he's saying that these things are only prisons if you allow them to. And he says, because mind's innocent and quiet take that for a hermitage. Now, we can see here that the speaker sees himself as innocent. Remember, he's being imprisoned now for supporting the king who, as we can see further back in the poem, he really believes is the true ruler of England, and he's incredibly loyal to him. So being imprisoned for being loyal to the king is something that he doesn't see as being a crime, so he sees himself as being innocent here. So mind's innocent, his mind is innocent, and quiet take that for a hermitage. Now, a hermitage would be the dwelling of a hermit, and a hermit in the old days would go and find some secluded place and close himself up in there and would have a time of peace and contemplation, very often for years. And so what the speaker's saying over here is that this being locked up, if your mind is innocent, if your mind is quiet, you can actually just use the time for a time of peace and contemplation. Right, so the last four lines of the poem, we see that first of all the speaker says, if I have freedom in my love and in my soul am free. Now, if I have freedom in my love relates to our first stanza where we see that love creates freedom for the speaker, and I think it's not just that romantic love symbolized by Althea in the first stanza, but it's also his love for the king. And he says, and in my soul am free. Now, that freedom over here is not just that freedom that love or drinking gives him, but it's the freedom that's freedom from guilt, and that comes from his confidence in his support for the king. It goes on to say that angels alone that soar above enjoy such liberty. Now, the angels that soar above, notice there's a little bit of a link here to the wings in the first stanza and to the gods in the first stanza. And they say that only those angels enjoy such liberty. So, in other words, when he is so free because of everything he does, so we have his love, we have his drinking and revelry, and we have his extreme loyalty to the king. So, the freedom that he enjoys because of this, and because of the innocence he has in that, the only creatures that are able to enjoy such freedom are the angels that soar above. All right, thank you. Cheers.